Okay, so this is the second of a series of review videos on information that we have covered throughout this year, going now back to the very beginning of the chapter, or actually the very beginning of the OpenStax textbook, and looking at chapter 1, and which is the real foundation, right? What is biology? So we have here that biology is a study of living things and their interactions with each other, with one another, and their physical environment. So this picture here is just showing lots of different scientific fields, and giving you some sampling of the diversity in science that we can investigate, but biology is where we're headed here. So the other piece that's almost always put into all textbooks is this idea that we should have a good idea of the scientific method, because as scientists, this is how we approach problem solving, and that's through this kind of a flow chart or series of things which can clearly link back on one of these boxes, can go off and back to another, but making an observation, asking a question, forming a hypothesis. Sometimes the question may become before the observation. It doesn't in here put any background information down that you might need, but all of these things are sort of a way to move forward in science and to, at the end, be able to say, did I find that a hypothesis that I made is correct or incorrect, and then going from there. So these are just some steps to consider. In Chapter 1, Section 2, however, we're looking now at more of the details of what is life, what are properties that all living things have, and what, at least as a start on how we can organize, show organization within this large thing that we call larger than life. So, properties of life include this listing: order, sensitivity or response, reproduction, growth and development, etc. To show that, I think it's easier to look at pictures, because I think it helps when we're seeing these different ideas. So order is really referring to this idea that living things are organized. And they're organized from very simple structures up into much more complex structures. And here's an example. We can use this then to launch into that hierarchy from cells working together to form tissues of different types working together to form an organ, and organs ultimately forming organ systems. So that's a good way to kind of think about this order of structure and function in living organisms. And then in response to stimuli, I'm going to move this over just a little bit so you can see. Basically, the response to stimuli having to do with how, in this case, plants respond to light, or this other plant called mimosa, which is very sensitive to touch, and then will droop when it's touched and then go back to normal. So response is very important to all living things. Other things to look at are, whoops, didn't mean to move that guy. I'm going to move this here, whoops, over here just a little bit more. We're going to move this whole thing if we can. Not doing too well, but at any rate, so properties of life include things like reproduction, growth and development, regulation. So on this one, this hopefully looks familiar, in that this is a good example of regulation, how living things have to figure out ways of controlling what is coming into their cells or out of their cells. So this would be an example of regulation. The different signals that can cause this to happen, the different materials that might come in or go out. Homeostasis, which means steady state. So how does an organism respond to changes in environmental conditions, for example, that will help it to maintain its long-term integrity? So here you can see some little pine or fir trees down here, and you also see some aspen trees. Clearly it's October when I took this picture, so we're seeing the change of the seasons, and what these organisms are doing in response to the loss of light intensity or water or both. We know that all organisms also have to take in energy and process that energy in some form. So we see here on the left plants who are capable of doing photosynthesis using the structures in their cells called chloroplasts, and then animals who have to rely indirectly or directly on plants to get their energy. So those are considered properties of life. Now, levels of organization, when we talk about living things, in truth, we usually don't start at atoms, molecules, and macromolecules. We usually start somewhere around the level of the cell, because we say the cell is the basic unit of structure and function. But that's not to say that the cell isn't composed of all of these other things. So we need to take into account that we can look at all living things from the atomic level. What are the atoms or the elements that make them up? And how do those build larger things we know as molecules? What kind of molecules do living things have? What are these things called macromolecules? How do some of these form small structures we now call organelles? So these are levels of organization. And this chart right here kind of takes it from the organelle and moving upward. So to cells, tissues, organ systems, but then going beyond that. So not just taking a look at the individual organization of an organism, but then saying, okay, well, how about that organism within the context of these groups? So looking at populations and communities within their physical environment, the ecosystem, and then putting them all together, the biosphere. Now, this was our first introduction to this type of a look at organization, and this is the phylogenetic tree of life, which basically takes all living things and puts them in first into these three domains. Now, in your study guide, you might look at this again because I think there's a mistake on your study guide. Bacteria is one domain, archaea is another. Both of these would fit under that category of prokaryotes. And then we have this other domain, which is called the eukaryote domain. So notice the endings on that. So Y versus eukaryotes, which are looking at the cells of this big grouping, which can differ a little bit, but then you can see some of the organisms that would be included here. So this phylogenetic tree is just a way of organizing things by cell type, by some very important basic structural differences between these three groups, and then these two, bacteria and archaea, having some similarities in that both of these are prokaryotic types of cells. And that is, I think, a pretty good introduction to that first section of our OpenStax text. So there you go.